Stephen Fry, known among many other things for his amazing A Bit of Fry and Laurie show and as the mellow voice in the Harry Potter audiobooks, is celebrated across the UK for his hilarious comedic routines and general theatrical brilliance. But Fry had something very sober to say when in 2015 he was asked as an atheist what he would think or say if, when he died, he found out that there was a God and came face to face with the Creator. Fry's response was this: I'll say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? Fry expresses with such clarity and depth of feeling the argument that if there was a God, he would be malevolent for having created a world in which there is so much pain and suffering. Fry, along with many others, including many Christians, is struggling to understand how one can witness and experience the immense suffering in the world and still believe in a holy, good God. This question has sometimes been known as the trilemma. How could an all-powerful, all-loving God exist in the face of all the suffering in this world? While there have been many philosophical responses given to this question throughout history, philosophers like Eleanor Stump, Marilyn McCord Adams, Peter Van Inwagen, and William Lane Craig, to name a few, continue to think and write on this topic from within the Christian worldview today. In this session, however, we're going to take it a step further. If we stepped into the Christian worldview and assume that there could be reasons why God allows suffering, and it's possible to still believe that the all-powerful God of the universe is also all-loving, if we accept that the suffering we experience, which he allows, was never his desire for us, then the question arises, why would this God, who Christians believe intervenes in the world and performs miraculous healings, choose to heal only some people and not others? Why is it that one person claims to be healed of something relatively small, like a temporary minor headache, while others who are in agony find no respite? There are, of course, multiple encouragements to pray for healings throughout the Bible. For example, the book of James, chapter 5, verses 14 to 15, and multiple passages in the Bible which claim that God wants to heal in response to our requests and our faith in him. For example, Psalm 41, verse 3. So what does the Bible say about the fact that not all who ask for healing are given a yes? Let's explore the Christian thinking on this topic. Elijah is a well-known prophet from the Hebrew Scriptures. Elijah was praised for his faith in God and saw miraculous and powerful works of God, all recorded in the book of 1 Kings. In one story, in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 to 11, Elijah is recorded as having encouraged a woman who is a widow to have faith in God to see her very sick son healed. Elijah himself had just experienced God provide food and water for him in a very miraculous way. However, when in both of these encounters God does something miraculous, we also see a moment described in each of their encounters in which it appears that God is no longer with them, where both Elijah and the woman, having received a miracle, once again experience need. Particularly in the case of the woman, Elijah seems angry at God on behalf of her suffering. Elijah accuses God of having brought this tragedy upon the widow. But despite his protestations against God, Elijah still cries out to God to heal the widow's son. And the account records another great miracle of healing happening in that moment. This story is interesting for a few reasons and instructive about some of the things that the Bible seems to teach about healing. Elijah is depicted as a man of great faith. He has seen God provide for him miraculously, as well as heal people miraculously in response to his prayers. And yet the story tells us two other things. Elijah, like everyone else, also experiences need and encounters suffering. Elijah also questions God's goodness in the moments when he hasn't seen God intervene miraculously. Not dissimilarly to Stephen Fry, Elijah looks at the suffering of the poor widow who has just lost her son, and he angrily accuses God of being the author of this suffering. In this way, Elijah, as with many characters in the Bible, is presented as a very human believer. He panics, He feels confused and depressed. Despite encountering things that are incredible acts of God, he still struggles at times to understand how and why God acts as he does. One example of this, after one of the most amazing acts of God recorded during Elijah's ministry years, recorded in the very next chapter, in fact, in 1 Kings chapter 18, in which Elijah calls on this God to prove himself as real to all the people of the surrounding nations who do not believe in Elijah's God, and God responds unmistakably and powerfully. Elijah finds himself in a deep depression, doubting God nonetheless. God's response is not to scoff at Elijah's frail faith, but rather to care for his practical need for food and rest. Bible stories like this reveal that the most faithful prophets in the Bible experienced times when the miracles dried up. They also experienced confusion at why God intervened sometimes and not others. Stephen Fry is then, according to the Christian experience, not at all alone in responding with anguish and accusation at God when faced with intense suffering. In fact, Job, likely the oldest book in the whole Bible, is one long story recording the intense suffering of Job, who is completely confused as to why God has allowed him to suffer as he does. Job loves God and believes God to be good and all-powerful, and yet he's left in utter anguish as everything he loves and values is stripped away from him. Job receives no answer as to why God did not spare him the suffering he endured. And for Christians, this is indeed one of, if not the biggest question posed to the faith. In his book, Paradoxology, Dr. Krish Kandiah of the University of Birmingham looks at the paradox at the heart of Job's story, which asks the reader to consider that God is both powerful and loving, yet there are reasons linked to a greater reality beyond Job's understanding that are at play. It is ultimately Job's intimate relationship with God that allows him to trust even in the face of confusion and hurt. And even in his anguish and deep pain, Job famously views all that he has as a gift, saying, "Naked I came into this world, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." As with many other characters in the Old Testament, Christians believe that Job prefigures Christ, the righteous one who would suffer greatly. And yet Christ is the ultimate sign that God will make all things new and fulfill the healing and restoration that is hinted at in the last chapter of the book of Job, where we are told that after his suffering, he was blessed and died full of years. While the Bible doesn't provide specific explanations for the seemingly random suffering and injustices in this world, it is clear that God asks his people to trust in him. Yes, God can heal in response to our faith, and it's possible that we might not experience healing or receive blessing from God without faith. However, the Bible is unequivocal that we cannot directly correlate a lack of healing with a lack of faith, nor can we attribute it to God's disapproval of someone. Job is one clear example of a character in the Bible who suffers not because he does not have enough faith. If anything, it's the opposite. In fact, the book of Job makes a point of showing how wrong Job's friends are when they decide to blame him for his suffering, claiming that he must clearly be suffering because of something that he has done wrong. In John's Gospel, Jesus' disciples specifically ask him, "Rabbi, who has sinned that this man is blind? Was it because of his sin or the sin of his parents?" This is a story in John chapter 9, verses 1-3. Jesus' response is clear. He categorically states neither this man sinned nor his parents. He shuts down the judgment that his disciples were making at the reasons for the man's suffering, not unlike God's chastising of Job's friends when they come to tell him that his suffering must be a sign that God is angry with him. Another time, Jesus clearly refutes the idea that every instance of human suffering is a direct punishment from God is found in Luke's Gospel. Jesus is discussing the death of 18 people when the Tower of Siloam fell. Again, Jesus is unequivocal that the suffering of these people must not be thought of in terms of a judgment of God. In true Jesus-like manner, his reason is, how could you or I ever guess the judgments of God towards another person? Rather than concerning ourselves with the sins of others, we would do better to think about our own heart towards God. Back to Elijah. Ultimately, we see that even in the moment following the experience of a great miracle, in which Elijah and the woman experience great need once again, it becomes apparent that God was still with them during that time, and that he worked things together for their good, to quote a passage from the New Testament that we'll come to later. There are some things that the Bible is very clear about: the character of God, his justice, mercy, his love, his forgiveness, his goodness, and his ability and desire to heal. It's clear that one day God will heal all illness. It's clear that he wants us to pray to him to ask for healing in the here and now, even though not everything will be healed in the here and now. The Bible is also clear, though, that there is a mystery surrounding why God answers prayers in specific ways. Christians are taught that the reason God says yes, no, not right now, or not in that way, are not always revealed to us. We are reminded to consider God's character and let that influence how we interact with and trust in him. Reflecting on his objections to God when he was an atheist, C.S. Lewis writes, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" Later in his life, Lewis would be confronted again with the question of God's goodness, but this time as a Christian, when, having met his beloved wife later on in life, he had to watch as she suffered through a very painful cancer diagnosis. In his little book, A Grief Observed, Lewis records the heartache that he suffered during this time, both in losing his wife and in questioning the God who had come to mean so much to him and who still allowed him and his wife to endure the pain that they did. Timothy Keller and Pete Greig are two writers who recently and movingly dealt with these same questions in their books Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering and God on Mute, respectively. So if we know that God may not heal us miraculously, why are we still asked to pray? The Bible provides a few reasons. Among them are that praying to God helps us to remind ourselves of God's character in the midst of our suffering. In communing with God, even as we suffer, we can find comfort and solace and a balm for our soul. To learn from God about our specific situation, to ask him to help us to see things from his perspective. To remember that God is good and desires good things for us, that he has good plans, and that we can pray to trust and ultimately have eyes to see how he is working things together for our good. However, for anyone who has prayed and longed and hoped that God would bring healing in a specific situation and has not seen that happen, which can be a lot of the time, this can be heartbreaking. Despite seeing incredible, miraculous works of God, the Apostle Paul was also no stranger to suffering. He speaks of pleading with God to take a particular suffering away from him, the thorn in his flesh, which God does not do. And while Paul is miraculously released from prison and near-death encounters, he ultimately loses his life in sharing his faith when it was dangerous to do so. Paul did not know why God responded as he did to the prayers offered in faith. However, Paul seems to have encountered something of the love and friendship of God, that even without understanding God's ways, he was able to trust his heart and experience grace for the journey. And of course, the ultimate example for Christians is Jesus Christ, who just before his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane asked God if there was some way that he could be spared the particular suffering of the crucifixion. Crying out at the point of crucifixion, the words felt so deeply by so many, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And yet, as the account goes on to show, that while that was the real and lived experience of the suffering, the Christian story of the cross is one of triumph through suffering, of hope, of true restoration and healing. The Bible does not teach that we will be given specific reasons for why God does or does not intervene in particular situations as we might wish or ask. However, it assures us that God always hears our prayers and encourages us to come to him and ask. Regardless of his response to our specific requests, we are reminded that he loves us, is able to work things together for our good, and that one day he will bring full healing. Psalm 73 verse 26 says, My flesh and my heart fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. When I was younger, I was particularly impacted by a writer called Joni Eareckson Tada. I had been struggling with some issues in my life as a teenager and been given a book written by her for my 16th birthday. I hadn't thought much about it, but as I began to read the reflections written by Joni, I began to see the treasure that I had been given. That book got me through a very hard year at school. Each day I would take the book with me and read a different reflection. As a teenager, Joni, who had been an extremely sporty, lively teen, had gone swimming with her sister. On one fateful day, she dived into water and hit a sandbank and was paralyzed from the neck down. We might be trapped in a physical disability like Joni, or trapped in our inner self, paralyzed with fear or anxiety, hatred, or depression. Joni sought the best that the medical profession had to offer and speaks of how invaluable the incredible work of doctors and physiotherapists have been for her. Any of us who have access to this amazing opportunity, I believe, should accept any help we can from the medical profession. Sadly for Joni, though, despite all of that medical intervention and much prayer for healing, she continued to battle the physical consequences of that accident and still does today. So as a teenager, Joni needed something else as well. She desperately needed help for her soul as she faced the prospect of living the rest of her life as a paraplegic. I was incredibly encouraged by her story, as in the midst of my own struggles, I saw what deep faith she had found. As we end this session, I want to end with one of the poems that impacted me most from her book. There are strange soul depths, vast and unfathomable as the sea, an infinite longing for some infinite stilling, and lo, his perfect love is perfect filling. My Lord and my God, thou art enough for me.